And I think we have Dr. Murray Heasley and Liz Tonks present. Thank you for waiting. I apologise that we're rather delayed, but we're taking the slow and steady wins the race approach to our submissions, and it's important that everybody has a fair chance to be heard. So we appreciate you taking the time to be with us. So I'm not sure how you propose to order your submissions, but I will leave it up to you two both. Tēnā kōrua.
Ahi, Madam Chair, Commissioner Sandra Alafiwai. Ka nui te mihi kia korua. Ko mātou ngā mangai me ngā morihu te hungi te whakapono ki te whakanohanga kia rātou kai tō toko. As many of our network don't speak this beautiful language, I'll just translate that so that everybody's involved here. I'm just thanking both of you for hosting us here. And I've just said that we are the network of survivors of abuse in faith-based institutions and their supporters. Now that's a mouthful, and we're generally known as the network. So the network is inclusive of all victim survivors and secondary victims of abuse as children or vulnerable adults, their families, whānau, and their supporters, with a special focus on survivors of abuse in faith-based institutions. Our network also includes advocates, researchers, and expert advisors, local and global. You will remember our network member, Tom Doyle, giving evidence here. And we have people in multiple nations right now watching these proceedings. Marylands, yet another example of prolific abuse that has happened in an institution in New Zealand that was known about, but neither the church nor the state took any action. It operated at a time when abuse happened largely in bricks and mortar institutions, where it could be easily hidden or covered up by invested officials to protect their own and their institution from accountability. It was a time when the culture of social services meant the focus was on managing troubled children by removing them into care. This coincided with a lack of professional standards and accountability, the absence of suitably educated, trained and experienced staff, minimal monitoring processes and accountability of care institutions, and the lack of resource invested in vulnerable communities. Institutions became a dumping ground for troubled, difficult children, those with challenging behaviours, and those living with disabilities.
Kia ora, Commissioners. Before we continue, we want to pause and acknowledge the survivor pain and suffering we witnessed this morning. The sheer guts of the survivors who stood up before this hearing, and the pain we know is shared by other survivors who suffered the same multiple assaults and rapes at the hands of parish priests and religious and other institutions of this church or in institutions run solely by the state. Marylands was described in the opening of this hearing as catering for those who are mentally subnormal and delinquent. We heard later that the brothers didn't want the delinquent boys as their expertise was in mentally retarded boys. It is unclear what expertise they were referring to. To our shame as a nation, we allowed this labelling of our children who with their families were coping with disability, and we discarded them into institutions and psychopedic hospitals where they did not receive the care they needed and were abused. Caught up in this labelling were also troubled children coping with prior abuse or from vulnerable, dysfunctional families. Their trauma showed itself in their behaviour at home, at school, or in other care. Children who presented this way landed in the too hard basket with social services, particularly the Department of Social Welfare. These were the children placed in the care of the brothers. Add to the label delinquent or mentally retarded to children, and immediately any incentive for care and understanding is reduced. If the children at Marylands were also Catholic, their caregivers, the Predator St John of God brothers, could be assured that they were not only the most vulnerable of children, but already encultured into a belief system that gave the brothers additional power and control. Marylands was in reality a state-supported, church-run brothel that serviced the needs of paedophiles, and the children were essentially sex slaves and labourers, funded by parents and taxpayers. Make no mistake, the peer-to-peer abuse happened there was a result of it being normalised by the brothers and is their responsibility. For some boys, Marylands was just part of their journey through institutions such as Apuni, Campbell Park, Koatere, Borstal and prison. Survivors of this institution were prepared to suffer the additional trauma of speaking about this experience in public at this hearing. We particularly acknowledge you, survivors, for the invaluable insight you have given into that abuse that happened and what needs to change in all our institutions to ensure future children are protected. Dr. Michelle Mulvihill gave evidence to this inquiry. Speaking as a clinical expert in abuse and trauma, Michelle acknowledged and validated the implications abuse has that survivors have reported. Survivors have fed back to us how important this was and that it has been hugely beneficial and helped them understand their trauma. Trauma counselling is in short supply in New Zealand. There are too few with the specialist knowledge and skills required. And we're all aware of the lengthy wait our survivors have to be allocated an ACC-funded counsellor in many parts of the country. Michelle spoke to the facts of what happened in the redress negotiation process with the survivors of Marylands, especially noting the promise of Brother Burke to always be there for them beyond any redress settlement. That never happened. Once paid, forgotten is the common theme that still pervades redress processes today. She also spoke of the added impacts of enculturation into the trust of the church and its religious for survivors and their families. Michelle herself represents the trust and faith that the most intelligent of people are encultured into. She became a victim of the church's exploitation of that trust, leading her to assist with their pretense that they would put right what they presented as an unfortunate harm perpetrated by individuals, when in fact she found it to be embedded in the very nature of the institution itself. What hope has a child got to make sense of what they're told and whether to trust the truth of it? Perhaps the challenge to the truth of our evidence from the church will give the public some insight into what survivors cope with when they report their abuse.
Ken Clearwater, who was given critical evidence to this Marylands hearing, and I'm proud to call a friend, referred to survivors' understandable fear of the power and authority of the Catholic Church. This is the church described by Professor Quadrio, expert witness to the Australian inquiry, as, and I quote, a highly controlling organisation with a strict hierarchy and a lot of control over people. The Catholic Church is a comfortable environment for pedophiles. A lot of offenders seek situations where they can have access to children and where they have authority. So they have access, they have authority, and they have the cover of a very respected profession. This institution, the Catholic Church, has a public persona of Christian love and care. It has been globally successful promoting this and, until recent years, covered up its dark side of pedophilia and abuse. The St. John of God Brothers were the perpetrating institution who protected the 90% of their number who were caring for our children and who were later investigated or charged with assaults on children. These brothers were also responsible for the peer-to-peer abuse that they normalized, encouraged, and enabled. However, those ultimately accountable for the abuse that happened are the bishops. And let's be clear, the brothers could not be in New Zealand without the agreement of the authority in the diocese they operated in. That authority was the bishop of that time. The order could not stay operating in the diocese when the abuse was known about without the ongoing agreement of the bishops. The bishops were responsible for allowing perpetrating institutions to come across our New Zealand borders. They are accountable for not having them removed when they found out they were assaulting our children. Where there is sexual abuse of a minor or a vulnerable adult, there is only one centre of responsibility, the bishop. That's canon law. Bishop Martin, bishop currently responsible for accounting to survivors, their families, and New Zealand for what has happened, came to this inquiry with the same diminishing rhetoric of understanding, sorrow, acknowledgement that harm was done, and again, deferred action because he is still needing to listen and learn. Survivors have told Bishop Martin what he needs to know. The Commission has made recommendations, many of which he and his fellow bishops could immediately action. The current bishops know what happened at Marylands and in nearly every other of their institutions in New Zealand and have taken no action. Instead, immediately prior to this hearing, they employed their usual tactics to distract and divert by releasing data and suggesting to the public, and especially their church communities, that now they realize the extent of the abuse and that they were taking responsibility. They did not provide any accompanying information from their records as to the seriousness of the abuse or the impacts it had on survivors. The newly appointed Bishop of Auckland, Bishop Steve Lowe, used the abuse figures to reassure his congregation that the abuse in the Catholic Church is just an indication of sex abuse in the wider community and diminishes responsibility for behavior, referring to human beings as intrinsically evil and flawed. This is the bishop responsible for the broken, it's his word, and further traumatizing process the church continues to run for survivor complaints and investigations. Bishop Lowe completely ignores the core systemic abuse that is intrinsic to and caused by the church institution itself at a level far worse than secular society. An institution that not only protects sexual predators, but moves them and then demonizes and crushes survivors. He deflects and diminishes his institution's responsibility in the wider community.
This is the church that in the course of this inquiry has not stood up and been accountable to survivors, the public and New Zealand for the abuse it enables that continues today. Continues to run a complaints reporting and investigation process that is broken, not transparent, traumatising for survivors, and does not lead to appropriate redress, has failed to keep adequate records, or lost them, or destroyed them, or does not make them available, employs rhetoric to replace action, and relies on their influence and the enculturation of its members to protect its reputation, continues a traumatising redress process and does not ensure survivors receive their entitlement. Our church, whose authority is offshore, operates in New Zealand with privilege as a charitable institution and can rely on ACC and other state-funded institutions to avoid financial consequence for the abuse it enables. Bishop Paul Martin is inescapably responsible for accounting today for what happened at Marylands and why nothing has been done. He appeared before this hearing with no action statement and repeating the rhetoric we have all heard before.
Bishop Paul Martin stated, and I quote, "All abuse, including the enablement of abuse systems that allow abuse and any lack of care for those who disclose abuse is unacceptable and indefensible." I repeat this. Any lack of care for those who disclose abuse is unacceptable and indefensible. He told you commissioners yesterday he would not leave dealing with abuse to the orders today. This is the same bishop that John faced. You remember John in the December 2020, the evidence that he gave. John gave harrowing and horrifying public testimony to this inquiry in December 2020. He disclosed the sexual abuse he suffered from brother Kevin Giles, FMS. When he approached Bishop Martin for healing and for his response, Bishop Martin had not even read his statement. John reports the trauma of being face to face with the bishop, who was unmoved by the fact that one of the episodes of rape he suffered was in the music room of the bishop's cathedral. John was then dismissed by Paul Martin, saying he had no power over the FMS Marist order. Bishop Paul Martin was Bishop of Christchurch and will be the next Cardinal or Metropolitan, and will be in that role at the top of this totem pole until 2040, when I'm underground, providing his health holds up. When asked by you, Commissioner Sandra, yesterday, whether bishops should strengthen their oversight of the orders, given the abuse that has happened, Bishop Martin replied that on a day-to-day basis of the running of the life of the diocese, there is too much going on for the bishop to do that. He relies on dialogue, goodwill, and taking it, quote, only goes to authority lines if it really has to go there. Apparently, abuse of children is not a good enough reason. In the words of Tom Doyle, the world's most renowned whistleblower and our network member, I quote, "The violation of the most innocent in the church is a scourge that neutralizes everything that is Christian about Catholicism."
State agencies and unsuspecting Catholic parents trusted this church and gave over their care of their children to this institution at Marylands and many other places across New Zealand. Their trust has been devastating, has had devastating consequences for a significant number of the children placed in the care of the church. On every level, there were systemic failures that allowed the abuse at Marylands to happen. Those that knew did nothing. The culture of social services at the time, both state and faith-based, meant those in positions of power were under no pressure to use their authority to address the systemic issues and required change. It was the time, as we said, there was a lack of professional accountability for those working in these social services, and when the solution for managing troubled children and vulnerable adults was to take them into care. Monitoring of these institutions was largely left to social workers whose roles and responsibilities were not defined by professional practice standards, but by the church and state social services who employed them. Few had any recognised accredited professional knowledge, skills training or expertise to carry out the job they were employed to do. In the then Department of Social Welfare work, they were delegated enormous authority and influence over children and families' lives. When they reported concerns to superiors, whose focus was on providing care placements and not the quality of care needed, they were ignored. A litany of systemic issues underlay the failure of this department to ensure children were not lifted into care, rather than the responsibility they had to act in the best interests of the child. Successive governments failed to require sufficient safeguards to protect children. They failed to resource alternative solutions to care institutions. They failed to ensure that families in vulnerable communities had the resources they needed. They failed to require professional standards for all people who had access to children, when it was well known that the highest risk factor for child abuse is access to children not in the care of their parents or whānau. Within this appalling context of failure, church social services fill the gaps that further enabled the culture of taking troubled children into care, offering institutional resources the Department of Social Welfare was lacking. One of those was the Catholic Church, which offered the promise to work with New Zealand's most vulnerable people and communities. The Brothers of St John were only one of the religious institutions invited by the bishops to come and work with vulnerable New Zealand children. With all of them came the abuse we have evidenced. Up against these multiple layered state and church institutions taking no responsibility and no action are survivors with no resource, no power and no authority. Still the case today. It does not end with Marylands. The abuse perpetrated in the church did not end there. Sadly, we know that the same serious criminal abuse was occurring in other locations, continued and has not stopped. Closed down bricks and mortar institutions and not closing down the perpetrating institutions will not stop abuse. Perpetrators simply move their criminal behaviour to less visible locations and themselves to less visible parts of the institutions.
The abuse that happened at Marylands was not atypical or anomalous of the institution of which they were an enabled part. The Catholic Church of Aotearoa is responsible for numerous and equally egregious sexual assaults committed by clerics, consecrated men and women, and entitled laity in almost every iteration of the Catholic Church of Aotearoa. Similar assaults on children were carried out by assailants like former Father Max Murray, a diocesan priest, former Brother Charles Afiaki, an FMS Marist brother, Father Frank Durney, an SM Marist priest, Brother Desmond Fay, a Christian brother, Father Michael Schurz, a Dominican, Mother Lucia, a prioress of the Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions. If an Operation Authority, the police investigation into Marylands, were conducted into the Society of Mary FMS Marist Brothers, the Christian Brothers, the Sisters of Mercy, etc., it would yield the same results. Abuse was not confined by time, place, or location. Survivors in our network suffered similar abuse in the sand dunes at a local beach, at holiday batches, in their own homes, in sacristies attached to churches, schools, orphanages, the car that belonged to the local parish priest, holiday camps, sports grounds, presbyteries, seminaries, cathedrals. The list goes on and on. The common factor is these survivors weren't believed, either when they reported it. Very few prosecutions ever made it to court. Now, this commission has stated, and I quote from the redress report, "It is incomprehensible that human beings could behave like this. What is just as baffling is how those in authority failed in their responses to survivors' requests for redress," unquote. Well, in our view, it is neither incomprehensible nor baffling if one unravels the systems that underpin the behavior of this institution, which are repeated globally. Accountability is the key to stopping abuse. Systemic failures not addressed allow perpetrators and the institutions they belong to, both state and faith-based, to avoid being held accountable. Systemic failure is still at the very heart of why this abuse continues today. These issues have not been addressed because the institutions themselves and their authorities and officials with the power have not wanted change. If they did, they would have made it happen. Immersed in the culture and influence of their institutions, it is clear they will not be proactive and act to provide survivors what is needed for redress. Nor will they demand the independent monitoring and safeguarding required for prevention, and that will make institutions accountable for failure. As we keep saying, it is the state or government's responsibility to care and protect all New Zealand children from harm. New Zealand is signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that put the responsibility on the government. The state is required to ensure institutions, service and facilities responsible for the care and protection, safeguarding standards and monitoring that has responsibility to children who are abused. The Vatican, from where our bishops take their authority, is also a signatory to this convention, but continues to be in breach of it. Why has the institution responsible abuse of New Zealand children, the most responsible for New Zealand abuse, not complying with this convention, not being held accountable? We seldom hear of the papal nuncio. He's appointed by the Vatican. He is the Pope's ears and eyes in New Zealand. He has been referred to by a bishop as, quote, the Pope's spy. His approval is needed for the Pope's appointment of bishops and their removal. Through him, all things go to Rome, including all reporting of abuse that happens in the church in New Zealand. The papal nuncio has diplomatic status in New Zealand. Why has this diplomat, whose country is in breach of one of the most important conventions, not been expelled? The Catholic Church is an institution that is a clear and present danger to New Zealand children, and yet it is still allowed to have access to them. As the chair of the Australian Inquiry, Justice Peter McClellan, reminded us, the abuse children suffer in the care of this church are not just crimes carried out by individuals like McGrath. This, I quote McClellan, this is an institutional crime committed by the world's biggest organisation.
Commissioners, as you know, the oversight of a Rangi Tamariki system and Children and Young People's Commission Bill is before the House. The bill largely focuses on state responsibility for those that fall within its care due to their formal legal status of state guardianship, or those captured in the umbrella that covers all schools now that they are fully integrated. Between the cracks will fall the institutions that operate in less formal structures and the children abused within them. This will not protect the children who are in the pastoral care of church ministers or religious. If this bill is enacted, the same heinous crimes that happened at Marylands, still happening today, will not be stopped. Statutes that rely on government officials will not stop abuse. The evidence, survivors and the responses of current officials who have appeared before you at this inquiry provides us with no reassurance that they have changed from the same history of protection of financial resource and reputation as the churches, or that they have the institutional knowledge and experience required to recognise failure and hold themselves or others to account. The evidence of survivors' enactment of this proposed bill will also weaken the Office of the Children's Commissioner and silence a key advocate for our survivors. It is incomprehensible that ministry officials could introduce this legislation at this stage when survivors are still providing so much evidence to inform the systemic changes we still need today. Its hurried introduction and consultation process has denied survivors proper consideration of their lived experience of abuse and the request that the Office of the Children's Commissioner be appropriately considered for expansion with increased authority, and importantly, that any monitor be fully independent of influence of institutions responsible for the care of children. The Education Review Office for many years had a responsibility for the care and oversight of the safety of children. It didn't happen. We are all accountable. The behaviour you walk past is the behaviour you accept. As survivor Eddie said to this hearing, the behaviour becomes normalised. We as a nation have walked past abuse of children for decades. Where is the outrage when the media publicly reports the most shocking experience of children and vulnerable adults? With little reaction, their reports fall off media platforms within 24 hours, often within the hour, like a snowflake in hot sun. Where was the outrage when a third-time guilty abuser of children, Catholic brother Kevin Healy, noted by the judge as having no remorse, was recently sentenced to 3 months home detention in our courts because he was old and frail? What about the thousands of old and frail survivors left living in dire circumstances because of men like this, and because the institutions that enabled their abuse are taking no action? New Zealand tolerates abuse of its children. Unless we change as a society, it will not stop. Unless we dismantle the systems that support it, it will not stop. Unless we change our culture of acceptance in New Zealand, it will not stop. Our government has the responsibility and the means to make the changes required. Survivors need urgent action on their resolution to have the fully independent state body they ask for complaints, redress, monitoring, safeguarding, and the holding of all institutions to account. We cannot trust the church or the ministries to do this. The government must act.
Commissioners, as a network, we are extremely concerned. Little has changed. And the network and its survivors are faced with the same opposition from ministry officials and the same need to lobby government ministers for independent, workable, inclusive solutions to abuse that were required for inclusion in this inquiry. Survivors of abuse in state and faith-based are of one voice when they call for complaints, redress, monitoring, safeguarding processes and accountability of all institutions that care for children be within an independent state entity free of influence from any of the institutions who provide care. Commissioners, our survivors are dependent on you to stop the ongoing separation of state and church. Continued siloing of survivors will not allow the inclusive solutions needed, and perpetrators will hide in the furrows left in between. Commissioners, our survivors ask you urgently recommend to government a review of all current and proposed legislation to ensure that every child in every institution is protected from abuse. If statutes are not inclusive of all survivors abused in all institutions, abuse will continue. Commissioners, now with your permission, English is a lovely language, but we have many people in our network who are Fijian speakers or Tongan speakers or Samoan speakers or Tagalog speakers. And I would like to thank them for listening into this English, and may I now address them in their own language, with your permission.
Of course you may.
Winakabakalebo kang naporang kinamarama, nomani songgo ni kere mai e kindekau. Whakamalo atu ki he tokutaha kotoa pe okwe heni he anoni. Maraming salamat sa lahat ng nandito ngayon. Whawhi taitali tangatu. Ngā mihi kia koutou katoa e hui mai e tenei rā. Haumie, hui e, kai e. Thank you very much, Commissioners.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Well, thank you to the network as embodied by Dr. Heasley and Ms. Tonks. We're very grateful to the work that you put into your submissions and grateful to your continuing support of survivors and indeed of the work of the Commission. This won't be the last time we see you, I'm sure, but in the meantime we hold your submissions close and we'll take them into account as we prepare our report on this hearing. So thank you so much.